I am Natalie, 33 years old and a senior financial auditor. At my parents' upscale summer barbecue, surrounded by 50 relatives and country club friends, my golden child sister leaned into my fiancé and whispered that he could do much better than me. She told him to call her when he figured it out. My parents just laughed. I said nothing and kept slicing the cake. Then my fiancé set down his drink, walked straight to my parents' table, reached into his jacket, and dropped a thick manila envelope right into the potato salad. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart a toxic family. Growing up in a wealthy Connecticut suburb meant appearances were everything. My parents, Patricia and Richard, hosted their annual summer barbecue with 50 guests mingling on the perfectly manicured lawn. The air smelled of expensive grilled meats and blooming hydrangeas. I stood at the dessert station holding a silver cake knife. I wore a polite smile I had perfected over 3 decades of being the family scapegoat. David, my fiancé, stood a few feet away near the patio. He is the chief executive officer of a logistics software startup. He is calm, highly strategic, and entirely devoted to our life together. My younger sister Brittany approached him holding a glass of rose wine. At 28, she was an aspiring lifestyle influencer who had never worked a real job in her life. She wore a sundress that was entirely inappropriate for a family gathering and moved with the unearned confidence of someone who had every mistake funded by our parents. She pressed her hand against David's chest. She leaned in close enough for her heavy floral perfume to choke the air around them. Then she whispered loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear every single syllable. "You know you could do so much better than her. Call me when you finally figure that out." Patricia and Richard were sitting at the main patio table just a few steps away. They heard every word perfectly clearly. Instead of reprimanding her, my mother let out a shrill, delighted laugh. "Oh, Brittany is just being playful," my mother announced to the wealthy country club wives sitting nearby. "It is just a harmless little loyalty test. We have to make sure he is good enough for our Natalie." My father chuckled, took a leisurely sip of his expensive bourbon, and nodded in agreement. They expected me to cry. They expected me to throw a massive tantrum, ruin the party, and prove once again that I was the difficult and dramatic daughter they always claimed I was. But I did not shed a single tear. As a senior financial auditor, my entire career revolves around finding discrepancies, analyzing bizarre behavior, and remaining completely detached in the face of absolute chaos. I did not break down. I simply observed the scene unfolding before me. I watched the greedy way my mother looked at David's luxury watch. I noted the way my father leaned forward in his chair, eager to see David flustered or tempted. I kept slicing the vanilla cake, my hands perfectly steady, waiting for the inevitable numbers to crunch. I knew my fiancé better than they ever would, and I knew exactly what was coming next. David did not flinch. He did not yell or cause an embarrassing scene. He simply looked at Brittany with absolute and profound disgust. He gently but firmly removed her manicured hand from his chest and set his drink down on the nearest glass table. The ice clinked sharply against the glass, sounding unnaturally loud over the soft jazz music playing from the outdoor speakers. Without saying a single word to my sister, he walked straight across the lawn toward the main patio table where my parents were holding court. The guests grew quiet. The lively conversations faded into an uneasy silence as everyone sensed the sudden shift in the atmosphere. David stopped right in front of Patricia and Richard. He reached inside his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. He held it up for a brief second so every person in the yard could see it clearly. Then he dropped it directly into the center of my mother's famous homemade potato salad. The heavy thud splashed mayonnaise and potatoes onto the crisp white tablecloth and ruined her perfect table setting. My mother gasped loudly, clutching her pearl necklace in genuine shock. David adjusted his cuffs, looked my father directly in the eye, and spoke with a voice that carried across the entire yard. "The loyalty test is officially over, Richard, and I am happy to announce that the results have been thoroughly documented." 50 guests stared in stunned silence. Nobody moved, Nobody spoke a word. My brother Kevin stood awkwardly by the grill, holding a pair of tongs, completely frozen in place, like a deer in headlights. Next to him stood his wife Nia. She is a brilliant African-American corporate attorney who had always seen right through my family's toxic facade. She simply crossed her arms and gave me a knowing look from across the grass. She was the only person there who seemed entirely unsurprised by the implosion happening before our eyes. I watched as David turned his back on my parents and walked slowly over to me. He did not look angry or upset. He looked like a man who had just closed a very tedious corporate merger. He took the silver cake knife from my hand, set it safely on the platter, and laced his fingers securely through mine. The air felt incredibly still. The wealthy neighbors and extended relatives were holding their collective breath, their eyes darting wildly from the ruined potato salad to my sister's pale face. Brittany stood rooted to the spot by the patio. Her practiced influencer smile had completely vanished, replaced by genuine panic. She stared at that manila envelope sitting in the salad bowl like it was a ticking time bomb waiting to destroy her entire life. My mother finally found her voice sputtering and frantically attempting to wipe the greasy salad dressing off the thick paper envelope. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice shrill and trembling with indignation. David did not answer her. He just looked at me and asked softly if I was ready to go. I nodded. As an auditor, I knew exactly when an investigation was complete. The undeniable evidence had been delivered to the proper authorities, the audit was officially closed, and it was time to leave the subjects to deal with the messy fallout. The sheer perfection of the moment washed over me completely, replacing years of built-up resentment with absolute and unshakable clarity. We walked together toward the side gate, ignoring the sudden eruption of whispers from the guests behind us. I felt a tremendous weight lift off my shoulders with every step we took away from that manicured lawn. The fake image of their perfect family was finally cracking, and I was entirely free to watch it crumble from a safe distance. The slap of the envelope hitting the bowl echoed louder than the clinking glasses. For a fraction of a second, absolute silence commanded the backyard. Then the frantic scramble for control began. Patricia lunged across the table, her manicured hands snatching the envelope covered in mayonnaise before any gossips could get a closer look. Her face flushed a shade of crimson. Richard immediately stepped forward, puffing out his chest to close the distance between himself and David. His booming voice attempted to drown out the murmurs rippling through the 50 guests. He pointed a thick finger at David's chest. "How dare you come into my home and cause a scene over a simple family tradition? You are entirely overreacting to a harmless joke." Patricia quickly flanked her husband, waving her hands in a dismissive, frantic motion to the staring crowd. "It is just a loyalty test. Every family has their quirks. We were simply ensuring that you are good enough for our Natalie. You know how she is always settling for less than she deserves. We had to be absolutely certain you would not stray at the first sign of temptation." The sheer audacity of the gaslighting was breathtaking. They were standing in front of dozens of people, actively trying to convince everyone, and David himself, that Brittany throwing herself at her sister's fiancé was an act of parental love and protection. Richard scoffed loudly, attempting to project an aura of masculine authority. "If you cannot handle a little familial vetting, David, then perhaps you lack the fortitude required to marry into this family. Real men do not throw temper tantrums over a protective sister doing her due diligence." They spun the narrative, flawlessly painting David as the unstable aggressor and themselves as the vigilant guardians of my fragile heart. Right on cue, Brittany unleashed her greatest weapon. The crocodile tears began to flow. She crumpled into a patio chair, burying her face in her hands. Her shoulders shook with manufactured sobs, loud enough to ensure maximum sympathy from the surrounding aunts and uncles. "I was only trying to help you, Natalie," Brittany wailed, peering through her fingers to check her audience. "I saw how hurt you were in the past. I just wanted to make absolutely sure he was faithful. You are always so blind to red flags, and I could not let you make another huge mistake. I sacrificed my own dignity to test his character for you." It was a masterful performance. She had instantly transformed herself from a predatory woman trying to seduce her sister's partner into a selfless martyr bleeding for her family. Several older relatives immediately rushed to her side, cooing and rubbing her back, glaring at me as if I were the villain for not appreciating my sister's ultimate sacrifice. My older brother Kevin stood near the grill, gripping a pair of barbecue tongs with white knuckles. He looked at the ground, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. He saw the truth but chose passive complicity. He remained utterly silent, enabling the toxicity by refusing to challenge it. But his wife Nia had seen enough. Nia did not tolerate fools, and she certainly did not tolerate my family's particular brand of psychological warfare. The sharp corporate attorney cut through the crowd with precision, her heels clicking decisively against the stone pavers. She bypassed the comforting relatives, ignored Kevin's warning glance, and stepped directly to my side. She placed her body physically between me and the incoming barrage of judgmental stares, a human shield in a tailored jumpsuit. Nia looked down at Brittany, who was still producing forced dry heaves, and rolled her eyes with unbridled contempt. "Give it a rest, Brittany," Nia said, her voice carrying a cold, authoritative weight that sliced through the theatrics. "You are 30 minutes into a barbecue and already trying to secure an Oscar nomination. Save the performance for your non-existent social media followers. Nobody with a functioning brain is buying this sacrificial lamb routine." Nia then turned her fierce gaze toward Patricia and Richard, daring them to say a word to her. They hesitated. They always hesitated with Nia because she possessed the financial independence and intellect they feared. She squeezed my arm firmly, anchoring me in reality, while my parents desperately tried to construct an alternate universe. The crowd of wealthy socialites and extended relatives watched with bated breath, waiting for David to explode. They expected shouting. They expected a dramatic, tearful fight that would validate Richard's accusation of him being unstable. Instead, David remained entirely unbothered. He did not raise his voice. He did not argue with the absurd lies being hurled at him. He simply adjusted his suit jacket and looked at my parents with an expression of profound pity. He reached out and gently took my hand. His grip was steady and warm, grounding me in the chaos. "Thank you for the enlightening afternoon," David said, his voice calm, clear, and carrying perfectly across the silent patio. "It has been an incredibly informative experience. We now have absolute, undeniable clarity on exactly who we are dealing with today." He did not wait for a response. He did not look back at Brittany's fake sobbing or Richard's posturing. Keeping my hand securely in his, he turned and guided us toward the side gate. Nia gave my shoulder one last supportive squeeze before falling back to deal with the inevitable fallout alongside her silent husband. As we walked down the manicured driveway toward his car, I could hear the immediate eruption of frantic voices behind us. My parents were desperately scrambling to manage the confused crowd, spinning new lies to cover the old ones, fighting to preserve their precious social standing. But their desperate noise faded entirely into the background as David pulled out his keys, unlocked the vehicle, opened the heavy car door for me, and successfully sealed us both safely away from the absolute madness. The heavy car door slammed shut, cutting off the chaotic noise from the backyard. The sudden quiet of the luxury sedan interior wrapped around us like a protective vault. I let out a breath I felt I had been holding for an hour. David started the engine, his jaw tight, but his hands steady on the leather steering wheel. He pulled away from the curb, leaving the pristine lawns of my parents' neighborhood in the rearview mirror. We drove in silence for the first few miles. The adrenaline was still humming through my veins, but the cold, analytical part of my brain was already sorting through the data, looking for the most logical path forward. I turned to look at him, noting the rigid posture that had replaced his usual relaxed demeanor. "So," I said, keeping my voice even, "what exactly did you drop into my mother's potato salad?" David let out a short, humorless laugh. He kept his eyes on the road. "A meticulously compiled dossier," he replied flatly. 45 pages to be precise, printed in full color. I raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to elaborate. "Over the past 3 months," he continued, his tone shifting into something more clinical, "your sister has been messaging my private work number. It started with casual replies to my social media updates, but it escalated rapidly. She began sending highly inappropriate text messages late at night, propositions, suggestions that she would be a much better fit for a tech CEO than an auditor who works late hours. He gripped the steering wheel tighter. And then came the photos, unsolicited boundary-crossing selfies, posing in your parents' pool, posing in dressing rooms, always accompanied by captions suggesting I should upgrade to the younger model. My stomach churned, not with heartbreak, but with a profound, icy disgust. 45 pages of documented harassment. Why didn't you tell me sooner? I asked, analyzing the timeline. Because I know your family, David said, glancing at me briefly. If I told you after the first text, they would have called me a liar. They would have said I misinterpreted her friendly banter. They would have spun it to make you look insecure and me look arrogant. I needed a watertight case. I needed undeniable physical evidence of a sustained pattern of behavior. I let her keep digging her own grave until the dataset was comprehensive enough to present to the board of directors. Or in this case, the country club audience. The sheer logic of his approach resonated deeply with me. It was flawless evidence gathering the kind of meticulous preparation I respected deeply in my own line of work. I leaned back against the headrest, digesting the reality of my sister's calculated betrayal. They will still try to spin it, I murmured, watching the suburban landscape shift toward the city skyline. You know they will. Richard and Patricia have spent their entire lives shielding her from consequences. David nodded slowly. I know. It is fascinating in a morbid way watching them protect a 28-year-old woman who refuses to work. The bitterness I usually kept locked away bubbled to the surface. They do more than protect her, I said, my voice hardening. They actively fund her delusions. Do you know how much they spent bankrolling her failed lifestyle influencer career? They bought her designer clothes, funded trips to luxury resorts so she could take pictures, pretending she was sponsored, and paid for premium marketing courses she never bothered to finish. Also, they could brag to their friends about their glamorous daughter. I looked down at my hands, thinking about the contrast between our lives. Meanwhile, when I got accepted into my accounting program, Richard told me they could not afford to help. They claimed the economy was too unstable. I worked 30 hours a week managing a retail store while taking a full course load. I paid every single cent of my tuition myself. I studied until my eyes blurred, secured my internships through sheer persistence, and earned my position as a senior financial auditor by outworking everyone else in the room. David reached over and rested his hand on my knee. And that is exactly why you are successful. And she is sending desperate messages to her sister's fiancé. You built an actual foundation. She is just a facade. A facade they desperately need to maintain, I added, shaking my head at the absurdity of it all. They need her to be the golden child because admitting she is a failure means admitting their parenting strategy failed. They pushed me away because my independence makes them uncomfortable. I do not rely on their money, so I do not have to obey their rules. Brittany is completely dependent on them, which means they can control her, mold her into whatever perfect image they want to project to the country club. The disparity had never been clearer. My grueling path to financial literacy and corporate success had alienated me from parents who preferred obedience over character. This is going to get worse before it gets better, I said, my mind shifting into strategy mode. They cannot let this go. They will twist the narrative to make you look crazy. They will tell the entire family that you fabricated those messages or that you somehow provoked her. They will launch a full-scale smear campaign to protect their social standing. David pulled the car into our driveway and shifted into park. He turned to face me fully, his expression resolute. Let them try. We hold the primary evidence. We have the data. I unbuckled my seatbelt, my auditor instincts fully engaged. No more playing the quiet, compliant daughter, I stated firmly. If they want to treat this family like a public relations firm, we will handle them like a hostile corporate takeover. We document everything. We secure our perimeters. We do not engage with their emotional manipulation. We respond only with facts and strategy. David smiled, a sharp, calculating look that matched my own. Corporate warfare it is. I am absolutely ready for whatever ridiculous tactics they decide to throw at us next. Let the audit begin. The next morning arrived with the sterile precision of a corporate Monday. David was at his desk by 7, reviewing supply chain algorithms at his logistics software headquarters in downtown Seattle. The office was a masterclass in modern tech architecture, all soundproof glass and brushed steel. Security was usually tight, requiring encrypted keycards for elevator access beyond the lobby, but Brittany had spent her entire life weaponizing her appearance to bypass boundaries. At exactly 9:15, she strode through the revolving glass doors on the ground floor, wearing a white tailored pantsuit that screamed bridal aesthetic. She bypassed the visitor kiosk and marched directly to the front desk. The receptionist, a new hire named Ben, looked up in surprise. Before he could ask for her credentials, Brittany leaned over the polished counter with a manufactured, dazzling smile. She confidently announced she was David's fiancée, Natalie, dropping his full name and the exact floor number of his executive suite. She claimed she was surprising him with breakfast and needed immediate access. Ben, flustered by her aggressive confidence and designer handbag, handed over a temporary guest badge without checking her identification against the system registry. It was a spectacular failure of protocol that David would later address, but in that moment, it gave Brittany exactly what she wanted. Armed with the VIP pass, she bypassed the secondary security checkpoint on the executive floor. She ignored the warning glances from the administrative staff. She marched down the polished corridor, her heels clicking aggressively against the hardwood floor. David was deep into a conference call with his lead developers when the heavy glass door to his private office was yanked open. He looked up, expecting his assistant with the morning briefing files. Instead, he found Brittany standing in his doorway, her chest heaving, clutching her designer bag like a weapon ready to launch her offensive. David immediately muted his conference call and closed his laptop. He did not look surprised, only profoundly inconvenienced. He tapped a single button on his desk console to lock the outer access doors securing the perimeter to prevent a public spectacle in front of his employees. Brittany slammed the office door shut behind her and marched directly to his desk. The faux sweetness she had used at the reception desk vanished, replaced by a frantic, feral energy. She slammed her palms flat against his mahogany desk, leaning into his space. She demanded that he call Patricia and Richard immediately. She ordered him to retract every single word he had said at the barbecue, commanding him to tell my parents that the envelope was a prank or a terrible misunderstanding. She insisted he owed her a public apology for humiliating her in front of the country club elite. David leaned back in his ergonomic chair, steepled his fingers, and stared at her with absolute silence. His refusal to engage only fueled her manic desperation. When demands failed, she pivoted seamlessly to threats. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her smartphone, unlocking it to show a pre-recorded video queued up on the screen. In the thumbnail, her makeup was artfully smudged, her eyes red from crying. She leaned closer, her voice dropping into a vicious theatrical whisper. She told him that she had 1 million followers across her platforms. She promised that if he did not fix the mess he made with her parents, she would post the video. She claimed she would tell the entire internet that the wealthy tech CEO had been harassing her for months, that he had cornered her at the family barbecue, and that he had tried to force himself on her when nobody was looking. She smiled a sharp, venomous smile, assuring him that the court of public opinion would not care about his side of the story. She threatened to tag his investors, his board of directors, and every media outlet in the city. She gave him exactly 5 minutes to pick up his phone and text my parents the apology she demanded, or she would press send and obliterate his career. David did not flinch. He did not scramble for his phone, and he certainly did not beg. He maintained the same detached clinical expression he used during hostile board meetings. He slowly opened his top desk drawer. Brittany flinched, taking a half step back, expecting him to pull out a phone to make the call. Instead, David retrieved a small metallic presentation laser pointer. He clicked the button, sending a bright green beam of light cutting through the air of the spacious office. He directed the beam straight up, pointing it precisely at the upper right corner of the ceiling just above the heavy glass doors. Brittany followed the laser line. Tucked discreetly into the architectural molding was a sleek black 360-degree high-definition security camera. A tiny red light pulsed steadily on its smooth surface. David finally spoke, his voice completely devoid of emotion. He informed her that as a logistics software company, Handling sensitive international supply chain data, his executive office was equipped with enterprise-grade security. He explained that the camera was currently recording in 4K resolution and capturing crystal-clear unidirectional audio. He then calmly stated the legal definition of criminal extortion and blackmail. He told her that she had just confessed to a premeditated plot to destroy a corporation using fabricated assault allegations, and she had done it on a secure server backed up directly to a remote cloud. He set the laser pointer down on his desk. He advised her to leave the building before he forwarded the footage to the local police department. The blood completely drained from Brittany's face. The realization of her catastrophic miscalculation hit her like a physical blow. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She shoved her phone blindly into her purse, spun around on her heels, yanked the office door open, and sprinted down the hallway, leaving a trail of expensive perfume and absolute defeat in her wake. The fallout from Brittany's disastrous morning ambush did not take long to manifest. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, my phone began vibrating with a relentless, frantic rhythm on my desk. I picked up the device and saw a notification for a newly created group message. Patricia had assembled a digital war room. The participant list was staggering, containing 42 different numbers, including every aunt, uncle, first cousin, and even a few second cousins scattered across the country. She titled the chat Family Emergency. My mother did not waste time with pleasantries. She launched a meticulously crafted smear campaign designed to assassinate David's character before anyone could hear our side of the story. Her opening message was a massive block of text dripping with weaponized maternal concern. She claimed that David was a dangerous, controlling narcissist who was actively trying to isolate me from my loved ones. According to Patricia's fabricated narrative, David had forged the text messages and the dossier because he felt threatened by our tight-knit family bond. She painted a picture of me as a fragile, brainwashed victim suffering from severe Stockholm syndrome, completely under the spell of a wealthy tech executive who wanted to tear our beautiful family apart. She wrote that David had violently threatened Richard at the barbecue and had even tried to physically intimidate poor innocent Brittany when she bravely went to his office to beg for peace. Patricia begged the extended family to intervene, claiming she was terrified for my physical and emotional safety. It was an astonishing display of psychological projection. She was utilizing the exact same tactics fraudulent corporations use to bury whistleblowers, flooding the zone with disinformation to confuse the stakeholders and protect the guilty executives. I sat at my desk reading the paragraphs of absolute fiction, feeling a cold detachment settle over me. She was relying on the family's unquestioning loyalty to the matriarch. She expected me to panic, to call her crying, or to desperately try to defend David in the chat, which would only make me look hysterical and prove her point. I did none of those things. I simply watched the screen, waiting for the inevitable wave of collateral damage to hit. The digital onslaught arrived exactly as predicted. The family group chat exploded with rapid-fire responses, a synchronized chorus of blind obedience to my mother's narrative. My phone screen lit up like a slot machine as the notifications poured in. Aunt Brenda was the first to strike, sending a barrage of angry texts demanding I pack my bags immediately and return to my parents' house. She insisted that David's wealth was blinding me to his abusive tendencies. Uncle Greg chimed in next, threatening to drive to David's office himself to teach the arrogant tech CEO a lesson about respecting the family. The cousins followed suit, swarming the chat with a mixture of pity and condescension. But the most vicious attacks targeted the core dynamic Patricia had cultivated for decades. They accused me of being deeply pathologically jealous of Brittany. Cousin Megan wrote a scathing paragraph claiming I had always harbored bitter resentment toward my younger sister because of her youth and natural beauty. She accused me of helping David fabricate the dossier simply to ruin Brittany's reputation out of pure spite. They told me I should be grateful a man like David even looked at me, and that my insecurity was destroying the family. Message after message echoed the same toxic sentiments. They demanded I call off the engagement immediately. They ordered me to issue a formal apology to Brittany for allowing my fiancé to humiliate her. The sheer volume of the messages was designed to overwhelm my defenses, a classic pressure tactic meant to force submission through absolute social isolation. They wanted me to break. They wanted me to feel so alienated and despised by my own blood that I would crawl back to Patricia and Richard begging for their conditional forgiveness. I watched the notifications stack up 50, 60, 70 messages, each one more hostile than the last. They thought their coordinated outrage would intimidate me into silence. They completely misunderstood who they were dealing with. I was not the insecure scapegoat they remembered from high school. I was a professional who spent my days dismantling high-pressure intimidation tactics from hostile corporate entities. I did not type out a frantic defense. I did not attempt to present the truth or upload the security footage to clear David's name. Engaging with their hysteria would only validate their manufactured crisis and give them the attention they desperately craved. Instead, I opened my keyboard and crafted a response with clinical, devastating precision. I needed to send a message that would instantly neutralize their momentum and shift the power dynamic permanently. I tapped the screen, selecting my words with the utmost care, ensuring there was zero emotion attached to the delivery. The chat was still moving at a breakneck pace, full of demands and insults, when I finally hit send on a single chilling text. I audit multi-million-dollar corporate frauds for a living. Do not think I cannot audit this family. Watch yourselves. I did not wait for the inevitable shockwave to hit the digital room. I did not stick around to read their stammering replies or watch them try to decipher the legal implications of my warning. I immediately went into the chat settings, muted the conversation indefinitely, and disabled all notifications. I set my phone face down on my desk, the silence returning to my office like a physical weight being lifted. The message was sent. I had officially served notice. They could continue their pathetic smear campaign in the echo chamber of that group message, but they would do it knowing I possessed the skills, the resources, and the absolute willingness to dissect every financial and personal lie holding their facade together. I picked up my pen, turned my attention back to the quarterly financial reports on my desk, and went back to work. Let them panic. The real audit was just about to begin. Less than 2 hours after I silenced my family's digital tantrum, my office phone rang. It was my direct line, a number I only gave to high-priority clients and David. I answered on the second ring. Nia did not bother with pleasantries. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the static with the precision of a woman who destroyed corporate monopolies before her morning coffee. She told me to clear my schedule for noon, gave me the address of a discreet bistro in the financial district, and hung up. Nia was a powerhouse African-American corporate attorney who had married my brother Kevin 5 years ago. From day one, she had seen right through my parents' country club facade. She tolerated their thinly veiled microaggressions with icy grace, strictly for Kevin's sake, but she had always held a quiet mutual respect for my financial independence. We operated on the same wavelength of facts, logic, and zero tolerance for dramatic nonsense. I arrived at the bistro 10 minutes early, but Nia was already seated in a secluded corner booth. She wore a tailored charcoal suit, her expression entirely unreadable behind a pair of wire-rimmed glasses. She had a legal pad resting on the table next to a black coffee. This was not a sisterly catch-up over salads. This was a strategy session. I slid into the booth across from her. Nia pushed a menu aside and locked eyes with me. She commended my text message in the group chat, noting that it had caused a massive panic wave through my parents' household. But she had not called me downtown to discuss my excellent boundary setting. She leaned forward, lowering her voice so the surrounding tables could not hear. She told me we needed to talk about the real reason Brittany had targeted David and, more importantly, why Richard and Patricia had so aggressively defended her. Nia took a sip of her coffee, her gaze remaining fixed on me. She explained that after the disastrous barbecue, Kevin had come home completely unraveled. He poured himself 3 glasses of bourbon, a rare occurrence for my usually passive brother, and finally broke under the weight of a secret he had been carrying for months. The entire foundation of my parents' life was an illusion. The luxury vehicles, the sprawling suburban estate, the lavish country club memberships, and the endless funds poured into Brittany's non-existent influencer career were not paid for with old money or successful investments. They were financed by a catastrophic mountain of high-interest debt. Nia laid out the details with the clinical detachment of a prosecutor presenting a financial autopsy. Richard and Patricia had maxed out every line of credit available to them. They had taken out second and third mortgages on the house. They had drained their retirement accounts years ago to keep up appearances among their wealthy peers. The situation had escalated from precarious to terminal. According to Kevin's drunken confession, the bank was officially preparing to begin foreclosure proceedings on the family estate within the next 60 days. The reality of the situation slammed into my auditor brain pieces of a puzzle I had overlooked, suddenly snapping into sharp focus. My parents' increasing desperation for me to host their social events, their constant inquiries about the valuation of David's logistics startup, their sudden intense interest in his venture capital funding. It was never about welcoming him to the family. They were sizing up a mark. Nia explained that Kevin had discovered the financial ruin when Richard begged him for a massive loan to cover the property taxes. Kevin, knowing Nia would instantly uncover any missing funds from their joint accounts, had refused. Richard had sworn Kevin to absolute secrecy, terrified that the country club elite would discover they were completely broke. They were drowning, holding onto their pristine social image by a fraying thread, terrified of the impending public humiliation when the bank finally came to repossess their perfect life. Nia tapped her pen against the legal pad, her expression hardening. She told me that Kevin's refusal to bail them out meant my parents had to find another source of capital, a massive infusion of cash to save their sinking ship. They needed a bailout, and they needed it from someone with deep pockets, someone who could be easily manipulated into writing checks to protect the family name. The sheer scale of their financial negligence was staggering, but as an auditor, I knew that desperate people rarely accept their ruin gracefully. They look for a lifeline no matter how toxic or unethical the method of securing it might be. I sat back against the leather booth, processing the sheer magnitude of their deception. Every snide comment Patricia had ever made about my sensible car or my practical apartment was a smokescreen to hide her own impending bankruptcy. They were living on borrowed time and stolen equity. Nia watched me absorb the data, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough for the financial reality to fully anchor in my mind before she delivered the final, sickening blow. Nia folded her hands over her legal pad. She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. She stated plainly that the entire incident at the barbecue was a calculated setup. The loyalty test narrative was just a frantic cover story invented on the spot when David exposed them. Nia theorized that Patricia and Richard had actively encouraged Brittany to seduce David. They knew I was far too independent and financially literate to ever give them access to David's startup wealth. But Brittany was entirely dependent on them. She was malleable, greedy, and easily controlled. If Brittany could successfully hook David, she could convince him to leave me. Once David was married to the golden child, my parents could easily manipulate Brittany into funneling his tech millions directly into their bank accounts to pay off the foreclosure and maintain their lavish lifestyle. They were not testing David's loyalty to me. They were actively attempting to traffic their younger daughter to a wealthy executive in a desperate bid to save themselves from absolute financial ruin. The horrifying logic of Nia's hypothesis locked into place, turning a simple family dispute into a premeditated predatory financial scheme. The horrifying logic of Nia's hypothesis locked into place, turning a simple family dispute into a premeditated predatory financial scheme. I didn't just need to prove Brittany was inappropriate. I needed to prove the entire family's motivation. I thanked Nia, paid the bill, and headed straight back to my office. I closed the door, engaged the privacy lock, and opened my personal laptop. It was time to deploy the skills I used every day to dissect corporate malfeasance. I started with the most basic public records, accessing the county property tax database. I pulled up the parcel associated with my parents' sprawling suburban estate. The results were instantaneous and glaring. They were not just behind on their taxes, they had defaulted on payments for the last 3 consecutive years. A tax lien had been placed on the property by the county, and a secondary lien had been filed by a private collections agency just 4 months prior. The amount owed was staggering, far exceeding the liquid assets they would need to maintain their country club facade. I moved on to state business filings, pulling the corporate registration for my father's supposed consulting firm. The entity had been administratively dissolved 2 years ago for failure to file annual reports or pay franchise taxes. The business was a shell. I then utilized a specialized skip tracing database I occasionally used for deep dive audits, accessing public records related to civil judgments. The screen populated with a litany of lawsuits. Credit card companies, a luxury car dealership, and even the very country club they used as their social headquarters had all filed claims against Richard and Patricia for unpaid balances. The debt was monumental, a chaotic web of maxed-out credit lines, defaulted loans, and unpaid judgments. Nia was right. They were completely, utterly bankrupt. Their entire existence was a desperate performance funded by credit they could never repay. But the final piece of the puzzle, the one that turned this from financial negligence into federal crime, was buried in a commercial loan registry. I was searching for any recent lines of credit associated with Brittany's name, specifically looking for the funding source of her short-lived, disastrous fashion boutique. The search yielded a commercial loan agreement filed 3 years ago. The principal amount was $100,000 secured through a high-risk secondary lender. I pulled the digitized public copy of the filing. Brittany was listed as the primary borrower. Richard was listed as the first co-signer. And there, stark and undeniable on the second page, was the name of the second co-signer, Natalie Ann Brooks. My breath hitched. I stared at the screen, my eyes tracing the digital rendering of the signature. It was a remarkably good forgery, capturing the slant of my N and the loop of my B, but it was not my signature. I had never seen this document. I had never authorized this loan. 3 years ago, when I was completely estranged from them, struggling to establish my career, Richard had stolen my identity. He had used my pristine credit history and my rising corporate salary as leverage to secure a high-interest loan to fund his golden child's vanity project. This wasn't just poor financial management. It was federal identity theft and wire fraud. The magnitude of their betrayal was absolute. They had not only tried to sell my fiancé to my sister to save their house, they had already stolen my financial identity to fund her lifestyle. The audit was complete and the verdict was criminal. The audit was complete and the verdict was criminal. I stared at the forged signature for another minute, letting the cold reality of my father's felony wash over me. Identity theft was the legal hammer I needed to crush them, but I still needed the social nail. I needed irrefutable proof of their underlying motive to traffic Brittany to David. If I just brought the fraud to the police, my parents would spin it to their country club friends as a misunderstanding or a clerical error. I needed to trap Richard in his own web of greed. I picked up my phone and called David. I told him about the forged $100,000 loan. He was silent for a few seconds before letting out a low breath, recognizing the absolute severity of the crime. I told him we were moving to the next phase of the operation. I instructed him to unblock Richard's number immediately. I knew my father's ego and desperation would not allow him to leave the situation unresolved. Richard needed David's money to save the estate from foreclosure, and David's swift exit from the barbecue had thrown a massive wrench into their timeline. Sure enough, less than 15 minutes after David lifted the digital block, his phone lit up. It was a text from Richard, dripping with patronizing familiarity. Richard asked for a private men-to-men sit-down at his favorite downtown cigar bar. He claimed he wanted to clear the air and apologize for the women's hysterics at the barbecue. It was the exact opening we anticipated. I told David to accept the invitation but to set the terms. He agreed to meet Richard that very evening. We were not giving my father any time to strategize or coordinate his lies with Patricia. The trap was set, and the prey was walking right into it. David arrived at my apartment an hour before the scheduled meeting to prepare. We lived in a state with single-party consent laws for recording conversations, meaning as long as David was part of the dialogue, he did not need to inform Richard that he was documenting every word. We bypassed standard smartphone recorders, opting instead for a professional-grade audio device David utilized for dictating corporate memos. We secured the small flat microphone securely inside the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket, testing the audio pickup twice to ensure crystal clear sound quality. He looked sharp, wealthy, and entirely composed, the exact image that would make a desperate bankrupt man like Richard salivate. The cigar bar was a dimly lit, oak-paneled establishment designed for men who liked to pretend they controlled the city. David walked in exactly on time and found Richard already seated in a leather booth near the back, nursing a scotch. My father stood up, extending a hand with a wide, overly familiar smile, acting as if the disastrous barbecue had never happened. David shook his hand firmly, but kept his expression neutral, taking the seat across from him. Richard ordered David a premium scotch and immediately launched into a rehearsed monologue. He attempted to build camaraderie by rolling his eyes at the emotional nature of women, specifically blaming Patricia and Brittany for the weekend's drama. David did not offer agreement or validation. He simply let the silence stretch, a proven negotiation tactic that forces the other party to keep talking to fill the void. Richard, increasingly unnerved by David's calm detachment, ordered a second drink. The alcohol and the pressure of his impending foreclosure began to loosen his tongue. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished wood table, and shifted his tone from apologetic host to a conspiratorial mentor. He told David that he recognized a fellow visionary. He praised David's logistics startup, inflating the company's valuation numbers wildly, proving he had been desperately researching David's net worth. David took a slow sip of his drink and asked Richard directly what the purpose of the meeting was. The recording device captured the exact moment my father decided to gamble his entire family's future on a desperate play for tech money. Richard swirled the amber liquid in his glass, lowering his voice conspiratorially. He told David that while he loved me dearly, he had to admit that I was incredibly rigid. He used words like stubborn, career-obsessed, and difficult to manage. He suggested that a man in David's position, a CEO, destined for high society, needed a partner who understood optics and networking. He explicitly stated that I was too focused on spreadsheets to be a proper asset to a powerful man. Then the hook dropped. Richard leaned closer and seamlessly shifted the focus to the golden child. He described Brittany as adaptable, socially graceful, and perfectly suited for the demands of executive entertaining. He told David that Brittany had always admired him, and that she simply understood how to treat a successful man. The transaction was laid bare. Richard then framed the ultimate condition. He told David that families like theirs thrived on mutual investment. He suggested that if David were to align his assets with someone more cooperative like Brittany, the family would welcome him with open arms. In exchange for this perfect, compliant trophy wife, Richard merely asked for David to step in as a primary investor in the family's estate and business ventures. He was asking for a multi-million-dollar bailout, offering his younger daughter as the collateral and casually discarding my entire existence to secure his own financial survival. David did not react with anger. He maintained his steady, calculating gaze, thanked Richard for his unprecedented honesty, and stated he had a lot to think about. He stood up, left a $50 bill on the table for his untouched drink, and walked out of the cigar bar. We had the motive, the method, and the confession. The audio file was secured. The next day, my phone buzzed with an uncharacteristically formal message from Patricia. It was an invitation to a private reconciliation dinner at a Michelin-starred steakhouse downtown, notoriously difficult to book on short notice. She claimed Richard's behavior at the barbecue was out of line, and they simply wanted an opportunity for the four of us herself, Richard, Brittany, and me, to clear the air and find a path forward as a family. She explicitly requested that David not attend, framing it as a delicate conversation meant strictly for blood relatives. The invitation was a glaring red flag. Patricia never apologized without an ulterior motive, and she certainly never booked $1,000 dinner just to smooth things over. I knew it was a trap. But with the forged loan documents burning a hole in my digital files and the wire recording secured, I was ready to see exactly what kind of play she was attempting. I accepted the invitation, selected a sharp, minimalist charcoal suit, and arrived exactly 5 minutes early. The maitre d' escorted me to a semi-private alcove near the back of the restaurant. As I approached the table, the scope of the ambush became immediately clear. Patricia, Richard, and Brittany were already seated, but they were not alone. Sitting directly across from Richard was Arthur Vance, a prominent venture capitalist, and more importantly, a key early investor in David's logistics startup. Arthur was a ruthless businessman who valued stability and discretion above all else. My parents, desperate to inject themselves into David's financial orbit, had somehow leveraged a tenuous country club connection to secure his presence tonight. The reconciliation dinner was a meticulously staged performance designed to sabotage my credibility in front of one of the most powerful men in David's professional network. Patricia stood up immediately, offering a practiced, overly warm smile. She introduced me to Arthur, emphasizing how thrilled they were to finally get the family together. I shook Arthur's hand, my grip firm, matching his steady gaze. I took the only remaining seat, which positioned me directly across from Brittany. She was wearing a silk slip dress that was entirely too formal for the occasion, her makeup flawless, her expression arranged in a mask of demure innocence. As the waiter poured the wine, Patricia launched the first phase of her offensive. She leaned toward Arthur, sighing with theatrical concern. She began to weave a narrative designed to portray me as fragile and erratic. She told Arthur how incredibly proud they were of my career, but quickly pivoted to expressing deep worry about my workload. She claimed I had been exhibiting signs of severe burnout, mentioning uncharacteristic outbursts and emotional instability, subtly referencing the barbecue incident without providing any context. She painted a picture of a woman crumbling under pressure, incapable of handling the stress of corporate audits, let alone the demands of being a CEO's wife. She sighed heavily, shaking her head. "We just want Natalie to find some peace. It is so difficult watching her struggle to keep up, especially when she has a history of these rigid, isolating phases." Patricia then masterfully shifted the spotlight to Brittany. She praised Brittany's emotional intelligence and her nurturing spirit, claiming that Brittany had always been the anchor of the family, the one who understood how to support high-achieving men without adding to their stress. Brittany smiled modestly, placing a delicate hand over her heart, and murmured something about how family always comes first. The implication was crystal clear to anyone reading between the lines. Patricia was actively pitching her younger daughter to Arthur Vance as a more suitable, stable, and socially adept match for his star CEO, while simultaneously attempting to poison my reputation so Arthur would view me as a liability to David's company. I did not interrupt Patricia's monologue. I did not get defensive, and I certainly did not raise my voice. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water, watching Arthur absorb the performance. When Patricia finally paused to take a breath, I placed my glass down and looked directly at the venture capitalist. I bypassed the emotional manipulation entirely and attacked the one area where I held absolute supremacy: the data. "It is fascinating that you bring up workload, Mother," I said, my voice cutting through the ambient restaurant noise with icy precision. "Because the stress isn't coming from the audits themselves, but from the alarming frequency of financial negligence we are uncovering this quarter." I turned my full attention to Arthur. "Mr. Vance, David mentioned your firm recently acquired a series of mid-market retail portfolios. We are seeing a massive spike in synthetic identity fraud within that sector, specifically perpetrators forging secondary signatures on high-interest commercial loans to circumvent liquidity ratios. It is a federal offense, of course, but surprisingly common among entities facing imminent foreclosure." The color drained instantly from Richard's face. He nearly choked on his scotch. Patricia froze her wineglass suspended halfway to her mouth. They knew exactly what I was talking about. I was holding the forged $100,000 loan directly over their heads in front of a billionaire investor. I didn't stop there. I turned my gaze to Brittany, adopting a tone of polite, professional inquiry. Brittany, you launched a retail boutique a few years ago, didn't you? Tell me, when you structured your initial capital raise, did you opt for a traditional mezzanine debt structure, or did you rely on leveraged equity? Because the current interest rates on unsecured commercial loans are absolutely brutal without a compliant cosigner. Brittany stared at me, her eyes wide and blank. She opened her mouth, but she had absolutely no idea what any of those words meant. She stammered, looking frantically at Richard for help. I, we just used a bank, she managed to squeak out, sounding entirely foolish. I smiled a sharp, predatory expression. Fascinating, I replied dismissively before turning back to Arthur. I engaged him in a rapid-fire 10-minute discussion on corporate compliance, risk mitigation, and SEC reporting requirements. I demonstrated an elite, comprehensive understanding of the financial structures that protected his investments. I made it abundantly clear that I was not a fragile emotional liability, but a highly skilled asset. Meanwhile, my parents sat in terrified, humiliated silence, trapped at a table with a daughter who had just proven she possessed the intellect to outmaneuver them, the composure to humiliate them, and the evidence to send them to federal prison. The drive to my apartment after dinner was peaceful. David and I did not celebrate. The sheer devastation radiating from my parents' side of the table was satisfying enough. But the night was not over. At 2 a.m, the silence broke. David's encrypted corporate phone reserved for supply chain emergencies buzzed sharply. David reached over, glanced at the glowing screen in the dark, and frowned. The caller ID displayed an unknown local number. He pressed the speaker icon, setting the device on the nightstand. The heavy, rhythmic thumping of bass from a nightclub filtered through the speaker, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of a woman crying. It was Brittany, humiliated beyond repair at the steakhouse, and undoubtedly scolded by Patricia for looking foolish in front of Arthur Vance. She had resorted to liquid courage. She was entirely intoxicated, her words slurring together as she launched into a desperate, frantic monologue. She did not realize she had reached a voicemail system designed to automatically record and transcribe off-hour messages for David's executive team. She just started talking, operating under the delusion that David was listening live and could be swayed by a tearful late-night plea. Brittany began by complaining bitterly about me. She whined that I was always trying to ruin her life, that I had purposely used big words at the restaurant just to make her look stupid, and that I was a cold, calculating machine who did not know how to love him. The sheer audacity was staggering. She genuinely believed that bad-mouthing me would somehow make her a more appealing option to a man who had just watched me intellectually dismantle our entire toxic family. She hiccuped, her tone shifting violently from angry entitlement to a pathetic, cloying sweetness. She told David he deserved someone fun, someone vibrant, someone who would not spend their evenings looking at spreadsheets. I lay there in the dark, my auditor instincts kicking in. I did not feel a single ounce of sisterly pity. I simply recognized a hostile asset actively generating admissible evidence. She was unraveling, shedding the last remnants of her golden child facade, and we had a front-row seat to the implosion. The background music on the recording shifted, indicating she had moved outside the club, her voice becoming crisper in the cold night air. The complaining abruptly stopped. The alcohol had completely eroded whatever minimal filter Patricia had installed in her brain. Brittany took a jagged breath and dropped the final fatal piece of the puzzle directly into our laps. She stated clear as day that everything happening was a coordinated plan. She confessed that Patricia and Richard had forced her to make that move at the barbecue. They had instructed her to test his boundaries, promising her that if she could secure his interest, their family would be saved. She admitted that the country club lifestyle was entirely fake-funded by maxed-out credit cards and secondary loans. She practically shouted into the receiver that the bank was seizing the estate in less than 2 months. My parents had convinced her that David's logistics startup wealth was their only viable bailout. Then came the ultimate, undeniable confirmation of the conspiracy. Her voice dropped into a desperate, breathless whisper. Just leave her. My parents need the money to save the house, and I can be the perfect trophy wife for you. She explicitly outlined the transaction. She promised she would look incredible at his corporate galas. She guaranteed she would host his investors with flawless high society grace. She offered to be the compliant, beautiful accessory he supposedly needed in direct exchange for him paying off Richard and Patricia's insurmountable debts. Brittany was openly offering to traffic herself to cover my father's financial crimes, confirming every single suspicion Nia had brought to my attention days ago. She ended the voicemail by blowing a sloppy kiss into the receiver and begging David to text her back immediately so they could run away together. The line clicked dead. The automated corporate system instantly uploaded the high-definition audio file to David's secure cloud server, timestamped and encrypted. I sat up in bed, turning on the bedside lamp. The pale light illuminated David's face. He looked utterly revolted. We had just listened to the Golden Child explicitly confirm a premeditated extortion plot designed by my bankrupt parents to traffic her for tech money, all while planning to discard me in the process. I swung my legs over the edge of the bed and walked over to my desk. I opened my encrypted laptop, feeling the cold, familiar thrill of an audit reaching its final phase. David walked up behind me, placing his hands firmly on my shoulders. We did not need to debate our next move. We had assembled the most lethal corporate dossier imaginable. Inside Folder 1, we had the crisp, high-definition security footage of Brittany attempting to blackmail David in his executive office. In Folder 2, the authenticated public records detailing my father's federal identity theft and the forged $100,000 commercial loan. In Folder 3, the crystal-clear wire recording from the cigar bar featuring Richard offering his younger daughter in exchange for a financial bailout. And now, in Folder 4, the final nail in the coffin, Brittany's drunken voicemail explicitly confirming the entire conspiracy. Patricia had been aggressively pushing forward with her plans to host our engagement party at her prestigious country club next weekend. She intended to use the lavish event to save face project wealth and lock David into their social web. I looked at the digital folders on my screen, then up at David's reflection in the dark window. We were not going to cancel the party. We were going to attend. We were going to let Patricia gather all 150 of her elite judgmental friends into one room. We had the required ammunition, and it was time to drop the ultimate bomb. The week leading up to the engagement party was a masterclass in psychological compartmentalization. Patricia, completely oblivious to the fact that we held her digital execution on a secure flash drive, kicked her event planning into absolute overdrive. She bombarded my phone with frantic updates about the imported floral arrangements and the lavish catering menu, desperate to ensure the evening projected complete financial solvency. Her country club, the Oak Ridge Estate, was the undeniable crown jewel of her social identity. Hosting our engagement celebration, there was her ultimate play to save face after the barbecue debacle and the disastrous dinner with Arthur Vance. She desperately needed her peers to see her as the triumphant matriarch, welcoming a massive tech fortune into the family fold. I agreed to every absurd demand she made. I approved the overpriced champagne cascade without a single second thought. I nodded along to the ridiculous swan ice sculpture she insisted upon displaying in the foyer. I knew exactly why she was doing this. She was betting everything on securing David's network, intending to parade him around to her creditors and friends to prove she was still relevant. She was building her own scaffold, completely unaware that she was handing me the lever. David and I spent the entire week finalizing our tactical strategy. We hired a private audiovisual technician, a trusted professional who usually ran high-level corporate tech conferences for David's firm. We paid him a significant premium for his absolute discretion and instructed him to bypass the country club's standard media system entirely. He integrated our secure laptop directly into the ballroom's main projection feed. As Patricia finalized the guest list, meticulously selecting the most influential members of her social circle, She was inadvertently curating the perfect jury for her own public trial. 150 of the most judgmental, status-obsessed individuals in the state were about to witness a financial and moral audit unlike anything they had ever seen. The countdown had officially begun, and we were completely ready to execute our plan with ruthless precision. Saturday evening arrived with a suffocating layer of summer humidity, but the inside of the Oak Ridge Estate ballroom was chilled to absolute perfection. The setting was obscenely opulent. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over tables draped in heavy silk linens. Towering centerpieces of imported white orchids dominated the room, masking the scent of the family's impending bankruptcy. I wore a tailored emerald green evening gown. It was sharp architectural and projected the unwavering authority of someone entirely in control of her environment. David stood beside me in a bespoke charcoal tuxedo, exuding the quiet, dangerous confidence of an apex predator scanning its territory. We greeted the incoming guests with practiced, polite smiles, shaking hands with aunts, uncles, and family friends who had viciously attacked me in the group chat just days prior. They offered me stiff congratulations, their greedy eyes darting nervously toward David's wealth. Then, the double doors of the grand ballroom swung open and Brittany made her entrance. The sheer audacity of her outfit caused a visible ripple of shock to pass through the room. She was wearing a floor-length form-fitting ivory gown covered in delicate beadwork complete with a dramatic sweeping train and a plunging sweetheart neckline. It was a wedding dress. There was absolutely no other way to describe it. She had arrived at her older sister's engagement party wearing a bridal gown, actively attempting to eclipse me and hijack the visual narrative of the evening. She strutted past the ice sculpture, flipping her perfectly styled hair, casting a triumphant, challenging glare directly in my direction. Patricia beamed from across the room, loudly complimenting Brittany's radiant appearance to a group of bewildered country club board members. They were doubling down on their strategy, shamelessly positioning Brittany as the ultimate prize right in front of my face. They wanted me to feel small and secure, and threatened by her aggressive display of youth and desperation. They completely failed to realize that her ridiculous costume only made our upcoming presentation infinitely more devastating. Every single guest staring at her bridal gown was about to learn exactly why she was wearing it. I did not flinch. I did not glare at Brittany, and I certainly did not cause the jealous, hysterical scene Patricia was hoping to provoke. I simply took a slow sip of my sparkling water and maintained a chillingly pleasant expression. David leaned in, his broad shoulder brushing against mine, entirely unfazed by Brittany's bridal cosplay. He chuckled softly, whispering that she looked like a desperate prop rescued from a clearance rack. We continued to mingle effortlessly, offering polite conversation to the very people who had plotted our downfall. The atmosphere in the room was thick with unspoken tension, a heavy electric anticipation masking the clinking glasses and string quartet music. My parents were playing their roles perfectly, circling the room together, loudly dropping David's name to anyone who would listen, cementing the illusion of their wealthy, connected family. From across the crowded ballroom, a flash of bright crimson caught my eye. It was Nia. She stood near the main mahogany bar wearing a stunning asymmetrical suit holding a delicate flute of champagne. As a razor-sharp corporate attorney, Nia knew exactly what the atmosphere of a room felt like right before a hostile takeover. Our eyes locked over the sea of oblivious, chattering guests. Nia did not smile. She simply gave me a single, almost imperceptible nod. The silent confirmation signaled that she was in position, completely ready to manage the legal fallout of the explosion we were about to trigger. The trap was meticulously set. The targets were completely surrounded by their own judgmental peers. The audio-visual equipment was locked, loaded, and fully operational. I turned my attention back to the center of the room, watching Brittany preen and pose for the hired event photographer, and waited for the perfect moment to initiate the final audit. The rhythmic sound of heavy dessert spoons clinking against fine china clearly signaled the evening's transition. The event coordinator stepped up to the small acrylic podium near the string quartet, tapping the microphone to announce the beginning of the toasts. Before Richard could even stand to deliver his patriarchal blessing, Brittany abandoned her photographer and practically sprinted across the ballroom. The heavy ivory train of her bridal gown dragged across the polished floor as she seized the microphone from the startled coordinator. A hush fell over the 150 guests. Patricia beamed from her seat, radiating pride as her golden child prepared to publicly claim the spotlight. Brittany tapped the microphone, letting out a high artificial laugh that echoed through the massive speakers. She welcomed the country club elite, thanking them for gathering to celebrate what she termed an incredibly surprising union. She paced the edge of the dance floor, locking her gaze on David while speaking directly to the wealthy crowd. She launched into a masterclass of passive-aggressive character assassination disguised as sisterly affection. She told the room how shocked our family was when David proposed. She painted a vivid, disparaging portrait of my life, emphasizing how I spent my 20s buried under mountains of corporate tax law and auditing spreadsheets completely devoid of passion or spontaneity. She contrasted this bleak, fabricated image of me with David's vibrant, high-energy status as a successful logistics software CEO. She questioned aloud with manufactured innocence how two such fundamentally different people could possibly align. She suggested that a tech founder required a partner who understood high society networking, someone who could breathe life into his rigid corporate world. Every word was a calculated strike designed to humiliate me and elevate herself. She was pitching her own resume to his social circle, framing me as a temporary administrative error in David's otherwise flawless trajectory. The audacity was staggering. She was openly attempting to sabotage my engagement in front of the very people Patricia was trying to impress. She paused for dramatic effect, allowing her insults to marinate in the minds of the executives and socialites seated around the room. She held the microphone close to her glossy lips, ensuring her voice dripped with manufactured concern. She told the crowd she just wanted David to be truly happy, implying heavily that such happiness was entirely impossible with a senior financial auditor. Brittany did not remain on the edge of the dance floor. Holding the microphone tightly, she stepped forward, her ivory bridal gown parting the sea of tables as she marched directly toward where David and I were seated. The ambient chatter in the ballroom vanished completely. 150 pairs of eyes tracked her movement. She bypassed my chair entirely, refusing to even glance in my direction. She came to a halt mere inches from David. The heavy scent of her floral perfume masked the smell of the roasted tenderloin on our plates. She looked up at him through her heavily mascaraed eyelashes, adopting an expression of wounded, tragic longing. Then she crossed the ultimate physical and social boundary. In front of our parents, our extended family, and David's most crucial business investors, Brittany reached out and placed her manicured hand flat against the crisp fabric of his charcoal tuxedo jacket. She rested her palm directly over his chest, her fingers curling slightly into his lapel. She leaned in close, closing the distance until her lips were practically brushing the microphone grid. She did not whisper a private message. She projected her voice so it carried crystal clear through every speaker in the grand ballroom. She told him he was making a massive error. She declared that she understood his true potential and that she would always be the supportive, vibrant partner he actually needed. She finished her public proposition with a chillingly confident promise. She announced to the silent room that she would be waiting right here when he finally woke up and realized his catastrophic mistake. The collective gasp from the surrounding tables was audible. Guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging horrified glances at the blatant, shameless seduction unfolding before their very eyes. Patricia sat frozen, her plastic smile finally beginning to falter as she realized her golden child had just abandoned all subtlety. David did not react with the anger Patricia and Richard hoped to document. He did not yell and he did not shove her away. He simply looked down at the hand resting on his chest with the clinical detached disgust of a man finding a cockroach on his desk. He took a single deliberate step backward, forcing her hand to drop awkwardly to her side. The physical rejection was immediate and absolute. He reached forward and smoothly extracted the microphone from her desperate grip. Brittany stood there, her arms suspended in midair, her theatrical expression cracking as she registered his complete lack of susceptibility to her performance. David adjusted his grip on the microphone. He looked out over the sea of stunned faces, his demeanor perfectly composed. He thanked Brittany for her incredibly illuminating speech. He announced to the Silent Country Club that her performance provided the absolute perfect transition for the presentation we had prepared for this evening. He did not look at Patricia. He did not look at Richard. He simply lifted his gaze over the heads of the seated guests, looking straight toward the soundboard, located in the shadowy balcony at the back of the grand ballroom. The private audiovisual technician we had hired was standing by the primary control console waiting for his cue. David gave him a single sharp nod. The trigger was pulled. The trap was activated. There was no turning back now. We were operating with absolute mathematical certainty. The entire toxic foundation of my family was about to be utterly dismantled in front of the exact high society audience they worshipped most, leaving them with absolutely nowhere to hide, ruined by the irrefutable truth. The grand crystal chandeliers above us immediately faded into blackness. A collective murmur of anticipation rippled through the seated crowd, assuming the traditional romantic photo montage was about to begin. Instead, the heavy mechanical hum of the ballroom's dual projector screens descending from the ceiling filled the darkness. Two massive high-definition displays illuminated the stage, casting a stark bluish glow over Brittany's horrified face. She was still standing frozen next to David in her ridiculous ivory gown. The video feeds snapped onto the screens. It was not a collage of our vacation photos or childhood memories. It was the razor-sharp, time-stamped security footage from David's executive office. The crisp corporate setting was unmistakable. The camera angle provided a perfect, unobstructed view of the heavy glass doors bursting open. The crowd watched in real time as a manic, highly aggressive Brittany stormed into the frame completely out of control. The high-fidelity audio kicked in completely unedited. Her voice echoed off the country club walls, stripped of all its usual fake sweetness. The guests heard her slam her hands onto the mahogany desk. They heard her viciously demand that David call Patricia and Richard to retract his statements from the barbecue. Gasps erupted from the front tables as Brittany pulled out her smartphone on the screen. The audio picked up her exact venomous threats. She explicitly detailed her plan to post a fabricated, tearful video accusing him of harassment if he refused to comply with her demands. She boasted about her follower count, threatening to tag his board of directors and local media outlets to completely obliterate his career using fake assault allegations. The sheer malice in her recorded voice was chilling. The audience watched David's calm, clinical response on the screen as he raised the green laser pointer to the ceiling camera. They watched Brittany's face drain of color as she realized her felony extortion attempt was being captured on a secure corporate server. The video concluded with her panicked, frantic sprint down the hallway, leaving her pride shattered on his office floor. The projection paused on a freeze frame of her terrified, fleeing expression. The contrast between the aggressive blackmailer on the screen and the woman standing on the dance floor in a bridal gown, pretending to be a supportive sister, was absolute whiplash. Before anyone in the room could even begin to process the visual devastation they had just witnessed, the screens transitioned to a solid, stark black background, featuring only a pulsating audio waveform. The date and timestamp appeared in bold white letters, showing 2 a.m. The heavy rhythmic thumping of nightclub bass flooded the ballroom speakers, followed instantly by the unmistakable sound of Brittany crying drunkenly into a phone receiver. Patricia leaped out of her seat, her face twisted in utter panic, waving her arms at the AV booth to cut the feed, but the technician ignored her completely. The voicemail played at maximum volume, sparing absolutely no one from the toxic reality. Brittany's slurred, desperate voice filled the cavernous room. The guests listened as she complained bitterly about me calling me a calculating machine who used big words to make her feel stupid. But the real destruction arrived seconds later when the background music on the recording shifted to street noise. Brittany took a jagged breath on the tape and the entire financial conspiracy was laid bare. She explicitly confessed that Patricia and Richard had forced her to make her move at the barbecue. The audio captured her exact words detailing how her parents instructed her to test David's boundaries and secure his interest. Then came the fatal admission regarding their wealth. Her voice echoed through the silent ballroom, admitting that their entire country club lifestyle was completely fake-funded entirely by maxed-out credit cards and secondary loans. She practically shouted on the recording that the bank was seizing their estate in less than 2 months. She confessed that my parents had convinced her David's startup capital was their only viable bailout. The final blow struck when she dropped her voice into a desperate whisper on the tape. The room heard her explicit transaction. She told David to just leave me, stating clearly that her parents needed the money to save the house, and offering herself as his perfect trophy wife in exchange for paying off their insurmountable debts. She promised to look incredible at his galas and host his investors with flawless grace, openly offering to traffic herself to cover my father's financial ruin. The automated voice of the corporate answering machine thanked her for the message, and the audio feed abruptly cut out, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. An absolute suffocating silence descended upon the grand ballroom. It was a physical weight pressing down on the 150 guests. Nobody moved. Nobody whispered. The string quartet sat frozen with their bows hovering above their instruments. The elite socialites, venture capitalists, and extended relatives stared at the blank projector screens in sheer, unadulterated horror. They had just witnessed a definitive, unassailable exposure of extortion, financial ruin, and familial betrayal. Near the front table, the silence was finally broken by a sharp, violent crash. Patricia's hand had gone entirely limp. Her crystal champagne flute slipped from her fingers and struck the polished marble floor. It shattered loudly, scattering glittering shards across the aisle. It was the only sound in the room, a perfect poetic representation of her fabricated high society life, completely disintegrating. Richard sat paralyzed in his chair, his face a sickening shade of gray, unable to even look at the wealthy peers surrounding him. Brittany stood rooted to the dance floor, trembling violently, her bridal gown looking less like a provocation and more like a ridiculous costume. The trap had snapped shut with flawless precision, leaving no survivors. I stepped forward, my emerald gown gliding over the polished floor as I moved past my frozen sister. I reached out and took the microphone from David's hand. I did not glare at my parents. I did not raise my voice or allow a single tremor of emotion to crack my composure. I stood before the country club elite not as a betrayed daughter, but as a senior financial auditor delivering a definitive corporate autopsy. The air in the room grew heavy and cold, thick with the anticipation of the reckoning I was about to unleash upon them. I tapped the microphone once, ensuring I had the absolute undivided attention of every venture capitalist socialite and extended relative in the room. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice echoing with clinical chilling clarity. "I want to apologize for the abrupt shift in tonight's itinerary. We initially gathered to celebrate an engagement. However, during our routine prenuptial financial disclosures, my team and I uncovered several alarming irregularities regarding the hosts of this evening's event. As a senior auditor, my fiduciary duty requires me to expose systematic fraud whenever I discover it. Tonight is no exception." I looked directly at Richard, who was gripping the edge of his table as if the floor was dropping out from underneath him. Patricia was hyperventilating, her hands clawing at the silk tablecloth. I held their panicked stares with a gaze of absolute ice. I explained to the silent room that what they had just heard was not a mere family squabble or a drunken mistake. It was the explicit confirmation of a premeditated, coordinated extortion plot designed to weaponize David's technology fortune. I stated plainly that my parents had actively encouraged my younger sister to sabotage my relationship to secure a financial bailout. But a bailout from what exactly? I turned my back to my parents and faced the massive screens. I gave the audiovisual technician my second signal. The screens flickered, replacing the audio waveform with crisp, high-resolution scans of official county tax records and state business filings. I pointed to the left screen, breaking down the numbers for the room full of investors and executives. I highlighted the massive red circles drawn around the defaulted property taxes for Richard and Patricia's sprawling suburban estate. I explained that the estate they used to host their lavish parties and impress this very country club had 3 separate tax liens filed against it. The collective gasp from the surrounding tables was distinct. These were people who valued financial solvency above all else, and they were staring at absolute proof of ruin. I continued my presentation detailing the maxed-out credit lines, the defaulted luxury car payments, and the administrative dissolution of my father's supposed consulting firm. I laid bare the undeniable reality that the wealthy matriarch and patriarch sitting among them were completely bankrupt, their entire existence funded by toxic debt they could never repay. Then I directed the audience's attention to the right screen. A commercial loan agreement materialized, magnified, so every signature was visible from the back row. Financial desperation often breeds criminal behavior. I stated, my voice ringing with authority. When my parents exhausted their credit to fund Brittany's failed fashion boutique and lifestyle influencer career, they required secondary capital. I pointed to the principal amount, $100,000 secured through a predatory high-interest secondary lender. I highlighted Richard's signature as the primary cosigner. Then I magnified the second cosigner line. My own name filled the screen. 3 years ago, while I was paying my own way through university and establishing my career, my father forged my signature to secure this loan, I announced to the horrified crowd. He leveraged my pristine credit history and my corporate salary without my knowledge or consent. This is not poor financial management. This is a severe calculated betrayal. This is federal identity theft and wire fraud. I turned to face the crowd, making direct eye contact with Arthur Vance and the other major investors seated near the front. I laid out the stark, undeniable truth. I explained that Richard and Patricia were bankrupt felons facing federal prosecution and absolute financial obliteration. They had realized their country club facade was days away from collapsing under the weight of foreclosure and impending arrests. Their solution was not to seek legal counsel or declare bankruptcy. Their solution was to traffic their younger compliant daughter to a wealthy tech CEO, using her as collateral to secure the millions required to pay off their fraudulent debts and save them from prison. They had arranged this entire engagement party to trap David in their social web, intending to discard me entirely once they secured his assets. The devastation in the room was absolute and instantaneous. The grand illusion Patricia had spent decades cultivating was entirely obliterated in less than 5 minutes. There was no recovering from this catastrophic public unmasking. The wealthy elite of the country club did not tolerate financial fraud, and they certainly did not tolerate being made complicit in a desperate trafficking scheme. Guests were already pushing their heavy wooden chairs back from the tables, physically distancing themselves from my parents, as if their bankruptcy was a contagious disease. They were completely exposed, stripped of every defense, every lie, and every manipulation they had ever used against me. Richard sat paralyzed, his jaw slack, staring at his forged signature glowing brightly on the 20-foot screen. Patricia had buried her face in her hands, letting out a low, keen wail of pure social agony as she realized her standing in this community had just evaporated into nothing. The elite members who had greeted her with warm embraces an hour ago now looked at her with unadulterated disgust. The kingdom of lies they had built to protect their golden child and punish my independence had been burned to the ground, leaving nothing but the ash of their own criminal greed. The immediate aftermath of my presentation was a fascinating study in human self-preservation. The absolute stillness in the ballroom cracked rapidly, replaced by the chaotic rustle of high society scrambling to escape the blast radius. The extended relatives who had flooded my phone with unhinged vitriol in Patricia's digital war room were now visibly vibrating with sheer panic. Aunt Brenda, who had viciously demanded I pack my bags and beg for forgiveness just days ago, physically shrank back into the shadows of a massive floral arrangement, her face pale with terror. Uncle Greg, the man who had threatened to drive to David's office to teach him a lesson, suddenly found the intricate pattern of the marble floor intensely interesting. They realized with horrifying clarity that they had chained their wagons to a sinking ship of federal felonies. The group chat warriors were suddenly entirely mute-stripped of their digital bravery. Several cousins, realizing their access to David's massive tech network was permanently severed, attempted to awkwardly shuffle toward my side of the room. They wore pathetic, strained smiles, their eyes darting nervously toward the projector screens displaying my forged signature. One cousin even had the sheer audacity to reach out her hand, stammering a weak excuse about how they were heavily manipulated by Patricia and how they always knew something was fundamentally wrong with the situation. I did not even blink. I simply turned my gaze onto her, employing the exact same cold, deadpan stare I used to freeze hostile executives during rigorous compliance audits. She immediately dropped her hand and scurried back into the crowd like a frightened mouse. The social isolation was instantaneous and absolute. The country club elite people who base their entire existences on wealth and status were actively turning their backs on my parents. Wealthy acquaintances were whispering furiously behind their hands, calculating exactly how quickly they could untangle their own investments from Richard's highly toxic portfolio. The united front of family loyalty that Patricia had weaponized against me my entire life evaporated into thin air. They were no longer a formidable, unified army of judgmental relatives. They were just a disorganized mob of cowards desperately trying to avoid being associated with bankruptcy and federal wire fraud. The gang-up had completely crumbled, leaving the three orchestrators stranded alone on the dance floor, entirely abandoned by the very people they had tried so hard to impress. With their audience actively rejecting them and their financial ruin displayed in high definition, the toxic trio turned on each other with the ferocity of cornered animals. The pristine, loving family facade shattered into jagged, ugly pieces. Richard abruptly stood up his chair, crashing violently backward onto the floor. His face was a mottled, unhealthy purple as he pointed a trembling finger directly at his wife. He screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice echoing over the silent crowd, blaming Patricia for every single ounce of their utter destruction. He roared that her insatiable, mindless spending on designer clothes, luxury cars, and exorbitant country club membership fees had driven him to absolute desperation. He yelled that he only forged the commercial loan because she outright refused to accept that they were broke. Patricia did not cower. She shrieked right back, her perfectly styled hair falling wildly around her face. She blamed his utter incompetence in business, calling him a pathetic failure of a man who could not even provide for his own family. Then, completely unhinged, she turned her venomous rage onto her golden child. Patricia pointed at Brittany, who was still wearing her ridiculous bridal gown, and called her a useless, incompetent disappointment. Patricia screamed that Brittany could not even execute a simple seduction, that she was a complete liability, who failed to secure the one tech CEO who could have saved them all from living in the streets. Brittany recoiled as if physically struck, but she retaliated instantly. She shrieked that they had forced her to humiliate herself, that they had ruined her entire life by making her their pawn, and that she hated them both. The perfect family was screaming, crying, and tearing each other apart in front of 150 horrified wealthy guests. The screaming match was suddenly cut short by a commanding, powerful voice that sliced through the chaos with absolute legal authority. Naya stepped out from the crowd and positioned herself directly next to David and me. She adjusted the cuffs of her immaculate asymmetrical suit and glared down at my parents with pure, unadulterated disgust. As a highly successful African-American corporate attorney, Naya possessed a formidable presence that demanded immediate respect, and she used every ounce of it now. She did not yell, but her voice carried the lethal, weighted calm of a judge delivering a final sentence. She addressed the room at large, ensuring the country club management and the wealthy investors heard every single syllable clearly. She formally introduced herself not just as my sister-in-law, but as my retained legal counsel. Nia turned her piercing gaze directly onto Richard, who was sweating profusely and trembling with rage. She announced to the entire ballroom that her client Natalie had uncovered irrefutable evidence of federal identity theft and severe financial fraud. She stated clearly that they had already compiled the evidence, including the forged loan documents and the recorded confession outlining the extortion plot. Nia then delivered the killing blow with flawless, chilling professionalism. She informed the country club management and the surrounding elite guests that a formal police report was actively being filed with the authorities as they spoke. She advised everyone in the room that Richard and Patricia were the subjects of an impending criminal investigation for forgery and federal wire fraud. Nia crossed her arms, her posture radiating absolute power, and declared that my family would be held entirely accountable to the fullest, most merciless extent of the law. The legal death warrant had officially been signed, sealed, and delivered in public. The heavy mahogany double doors at the main entrance of the grand ballroom swung open with a resounding thud that echoed across the vaulted ceiling. The sudden noise sliced through the tense, suffocating atmosphere left in the wake of Nia's brutal legal declaration. Every head in the room swiveled toward the entrance. Two uniformed police officers stepped over the threshold, their dark blue uniforms and the heavy metallic clatter of their duty belts creating a jarring, surreal contrast against the opulent backdrop of imported orchids and crystal chandeliers. They did not rush, nor did they look intimidated by the overwhelming display of extreme wealth surrounding them. They walked with the slow, measured, and terrifyingly calm pacing of men who were simply performing a routine bureaucratic function. The crowd of elite socialites and venture capitalists parted instantly, stepping back to create a wide, clear path down the center aisle, treating the officers with a mixture of morbid fascination and desperate self-preservation. Nobody wanted to be standing too close to the blast radius when the final hammer fell. The officers marched directly toward the dance floor where Richard, Patricia, and Brittany remained marooned in their own humiliation. Richard's face was a mask of absolute, unadulterated horror. He instinctively took a half-step backward, his hands raising slightly in a defensive posture, as if expecting to be placed in handcuffs right then and there. But this was not a theatrical television-style arrest. This was something far more methodical and legally binding. The lead officer, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a completely impassive expression, stopped 2 feet in front of my father. He did not reach for his cuffs. Instead, he unclasped a thick manila folder from the clipboard he was carrying. He spoke with a loud, clear, and uncompromising voice that ensured every single country club guest heard the official mandate. He formally identified Richard and Patricia, confirming their identities for the public record. He then extended the folder, pressing it directly into my father's trembling hands. The officer announced that they were officially serving civil lawsuit summons on behalf of my legal counsel regarding the fraudulent $100,000 commercial loan. Furthermore, the officer clearly stated the official police report tracking number that had just been generated at the precinct for the accompanying criminal investigation into federal identity theft and wire fraud. He informed them that detectives from the Financial Crimes Division would be contacting them shortly for formal questioning. It was the clinical, absolute delivery of their complete legal and financial obliteration served on a silver platter in front of the exact audience they worshipped most. The sheer reality of the physical paperwork resting in his hands seemed to short-circuit whatever remained of Richard's cognitive functions. In a desperate, pathetic attempt to cling to his rapidly evaporating social status, he fell back on his only remaining survival tactic. He tried to charm them. Richard straightened his posture, forcing a rigid, unnatural smile onto his face, and attempted to clap the lead officer on the shoulder like they were old golfing buddies. He let out a loud, hollow laugh, dismissing the massive stack of legal documents as a simple, ridiculous misunderstanding between an overly dramatic daughter and her loving parents. He confidently told the officers that his private attorney would clear up the clerical error in the morning, offering them a round of drinks at the clubhouse bar for their trouble. It was a spectacular, mortifying failure. The officer immediately stepped back, his expression hardening into stern, professional disgust. He sharply advised my father to refrain from attempting to bribe or fraternize with law enforcement and instructed him to sign the service acknowledgement form immediately. The brutal rejection shattered Richard's country club persona completely. He signed the paper with a violently shaking hand, his shoulders sagging in absolute defeat. Beside him, Patricia had gone completely catatonic, staring at the polished marble floor, as if praying it would open up and swallow her whole. But it was Brittany who finally broke. The realization that her parents were truly bankrupt felons, that there was no tech CEO coming to bail her out, and that her entire parasitic lifestyle was officially dead, hit her all at once. Her legs gave out. She collapsed right there on the dance floor in her ridiculous ivory bridal gown. She began to weep, but these were not the pretty manufactured tears she had weaponized at the barbecue. These were genuine ugly, hyperventilating sobs of a woman who suddenly understood she was about to be homeless, entirely unemployable, and publicly disgraced. I watched their total breakdown with the calm, detached satisfaction of an auditor closing the final ledger on a thoroughly investigated fraud case. The data had been presented, the perpetrators had been exposed, and the consequences had been officially initiated. My job here was completely done. I stepped forward, picking up the microphone one last time. The entire ballroom held its collective breath, waiting for my final words. I did not gloat, and I did not scream. I maintained the exact same chillingly pleasant professional tone I had used all evening. I looked out over the sea of silent, stunned faces, making direct eye contact with Mr. Harrison, the key tech investor who gave me a slow, deeply respectful nod. Thank you all for your time and attention. I said, my voice ringing clear and steady through the speakers. We sincerely appreciate you attending this evening's comprehensive financial disclosure meeting. I highly advise you to audit your own portfolios closely. Please enjoy the rest of your night. I handed the microphone to the event coordinator, who looked absolutely terrified to take it. David stepped up beside me, his presence a towering pillar of absolute security. He did not spare a single glance for the weeping, ruined family on the dance floor. He simply reached out and took my hand, intertwining his fingers securely with mine. We turned our backs on Patricia, Richard, and Brittany. We walked down the center aisle of the grand ballroom, our footsteps echoing in sync. The crowd of elite socialites actively parted for us, stepping back respectfully, their eyes filled with a mixture of shock and undeniable awe. We did not rush. We walked with our heads held incredibly high, projecting unwavering power and absolute victory. We pushed through the heavy oak doors, stepping out into the cool, refreshing summer night, leaving the toxic wreckage of my former family entirely in ruins behind us. The cool summer night air felt like a baptism as we walked away from the Oak Ridge estate. The very next morning, the digital shockwaves hit the city with the force of a localized earthquake. I woke up, poured myself a cup of dark roast coffee, and opened my tablet to find the internet already doing my job for me. Several younger attendees at the engagement party had secretly kept their phones rolling during the entire spectacle. High-definition clips of Brittany's unhinged microphone grab, followed immediately by the massive projector screens exposing the forged loan, and her drunken voicemail had been uploaded to multiple platforms. The videos spread like wildfire. The country club elite are notoriously gossip-hungry, and a scandal of this magnitude was absolute premium currency. Within 48 hours, the fallout was apocalyptic. I watched in real time as Brittany's carefully curated social media empire collapsed. The few minor fashion and lifestyle brands that sponsored her quickly issued public statements severing all ties. They actively distanced themselves from a woman now internationally known for attempting to extort her sister's fiancé to cover up federal financial crimes. Brittany deactivated her accounts by Tuesday afternoon, effectively erasing her entire digital identity to escape the relentless barrage of public mockery. But Patricia suffered the most devastating blow. The Oak Ridge Estate Country Club Board of Directors convened an emergency meeting early Monday morning. The agenda had only one item. Before noon, a courier delivered a formally drafted letter to my parents' heavily mortgaged doorstep. The letter demanded Patricia's immediate resignation from her coveted position as the social chair and formally revoked their family membership, citing severe violations of the club's strict moral conduct clause. The social circle she had spent her entire adult life worshipping had unilaterally exiled her. The wealthy friends she had desperately tried to impress were now actively ignoring her calls. She was entirely radioactive, permanently blacklisted from the only community she ever cared about. The local business network reacted with identical ruthlessness. Richard's remaining consulting clients pulled their contracts by the end of the business day. Nobody wanted to be financially associated with a man actively under investigation for identity theft and wire fraud. The magnificent, pristine facade they had weaponized against me my entire life was completely gone, replaced by a glaring, inescapable reality of their own making. The absolute isolation broke Patricia's resolve by Wednesday evening. I was sitting at my dining table reviewing the official police report case numbers Naya had forwarded me when my personal cell phone rang. The screen displayed a generic, unregistered local number. I usually ignore unknown callers, but my auditor instincts told me exactly who was on the other end of the line. I accepted the call and pressed the speaker button, setting the phone flat on the polished wood table. A jagged, ragged sobbing immediately filled the quiet room. It was Patricia. She had resorted to buying a cheap prepaid burner phone because I had already instructed my service provider to block every single number associated with their household. She did not sound like the arrogant, condescending matriarch who had commanded the country club just a few nights ago. She sounded thoroughly broken, her voice cracking with genuine, unfiltered panic. She bypassed all greetings and immediately launched into a pathetic, desperate plea. She begged me to call Nia and tell the authorities I had made a terrible mistake. She pleaded with me to drop the civil lawsuits and withdraw the identity theft allegations. She sobbed so hard she could barely articulate her words, claiming that the stress was physically destroying Richard and that Brittany was entirely inconsolable. She tried to deploy her ultimate weapon, the very concept she had used to keep me compliant for decades. She cried out that blood is thicker than water. She wailed into the receiver, insisting that family protects family, and that family absolutely never sues family regardless of what mistakes were made in the past. She begged me to remember the good times we shared when I was a child, desperately grasping at nostalgic straws that never actually existed. She promised they would find a way to pay the money back if I just gave them a chance to fix it privately. I sat perfectly still, letting her hysterical sobbing wash over me. A year ago, the sound of my mother crying would have triggered a deep, conditioned response to rush in and fix her problems at the expense of my own sanity. Now I felt absolutely nothing. The emotional manipulation tactics that had governed my entire youth were completely ineffective against the armor I had built. I did not raise my voice, and I did not engage with her delusional attempts to rewrite history. I simply leaned forward, positioning my mouth near the microphone of the device. I waited for her to pause for a breath. When the line went momentarily quiet, I delivered my final verdict with the cold, immovable weight of a falling gavel. Family does not commit federal identity theft, I stated clearly. I did not wait for her to process the finality of that statement. I did not stick around to hear her inevitable protests or her transition from begging back to screaming rage. I simply reached out and tapped the red button, cutting off the connection instantly. The room returned to a state of absolute beautiful silence. I picked up the device, navigated to the call logs, and permanently blocked the burner number. I then sent a quick message to David and Naya, confirming that Patricia had attempted contact and that the perimeter remained entirely secure. I closed my phone, stood up from the table, and walked into the kitchen to pour myself a glass of water. The chapter of my life involving Richard, Patricia, and Brittany was officially and permanently closed. I had severed the final toxic tie, leaving them to navigate the catastrophic wreckage of their own criminal choices entirely alone. Fast forward exactly 2 months. The legal gears ground forward with a merciless mechanical efficiency. Nia orchestrated the litigation like a symphony of absolute destruction. As a high-powered corporate attorney, she knew exactly which legal levers to pull to maximize the pressure on my parents. She did not just file a standard police report. She triggered a comprehensive federal inquiry into the fraudulent commercial loan, leveraging her contacts in the financial crimes sector. The terrifying prospect of facing a federal judge for felony identity theft and wire fraud finally shattered my parents' enduring delusion that they could charm their way out of consequences. When the investigators began issuing subpoenas and demanding financial records, the hollow core of Richard and Patricia's economic reality was laid completely bare for the courts to scrutinize. They had absolutely no liquid assets to mount a viable legal defense. Their credit was completely obliterated. They were backed into an inescapable, suffocating corner. Nia presented them with a brutal, non-negotiable ultimatum. They could either face the full wrath of the federal prosecution, which would carry a mandatory minimum prison sentence for the forgery, or they could immediately liquidate every single asset they possessed. They had to pay off the fraudulent $100,000 loan cover, all accrued exorbitant interest, and permanently clear my name and credit history. Facing the terrifying reality of federal prison, their immense pride finally collapsed. The liquidation process was a rapid, highly public, and intensely humiliating spectacle. The sprawling suburban estate, the very house they had desperately tried to save by trafficking their younger daughter, was seized by the bank and sold at a foreclosure auction well below market value. The luxury vehicles they drove to project false wealth were swiftly repossessed and auctioned off to the highest bidder. Estate liquidators descended upon their home, coldly cataloging and selling off the antique furniture, the imported artwork, and the designer wardrobes Patricia prized so highly. Every cent generated from the fire sale was directed by Nia straight to the secondary lender to extinguish the toxic debt they had illegally anchored to my identity. Nia heavily scrutinized every single transaction, ensuring my credit profile was restored to its pristine original state. By the time the ink dried on the final settlement documents, Richard and Patricia were completely and utterly destitute. They had managed to avoid wearing orange prison jumpsuits, but they had traded their physical freedom for absolute poverty. They were systematically stripped of their home, their cars, and their beloved social status, left with absolutely nothing but the crushing weight of their own catastrophic failures. The massive financial fallout did not spare the golden child. With my parents rendered entirely broke and forced to move into a cramped, low-income apartment that barely fit their remaining cardboard boxes, Brittany was abruptly cut off from her lifelong financial life support. Her brief, disastrous stint attempting to secure brand sponsorships had ended in public ruin after the engagement party videos went viral. She had zero marketable skills, a highly toxic public reputation, and an active eviction notice on the luxury downtown apartment my parents could no longer subsidize. Exactly 2 weeks after the estate liquidation was finalized, the security monitor in my home office chimed. I glanced at the live high-definition camera feed and saw a sight that would have seemed completely impossible just a year ago. Brittany was standing alone on my front porch. She looked nothing like the arrogant, entitled woman who had worn a bridal gown to my engagement party. Her designer clothes looked unwashed and wrinkled. She carried 2 large black trash bags stuffed haphazardly with her remaining possessions. She looked exhausted, terrified, and completely defeated by the real world. I did not ignore the bell. I calmly walked to the front entryway, disabled the security alarm, and opened the heavy wooden door. I stood in the threshold, keeping my posture relaxed, but entirely unyielding. Brittany looked up at me, her eyes brimming with genuine desperate tears. She immediately launched into a frantic, rambling apology. She heavily blamed our parents for manipulating her, claiming she was just a victim of their impossible expectations. She claimed she had absolutely nowhere else to go. She begged me, her voice cracking, just to let her sleep on my couch for a few nights, until she could figure things out. She promised she would clean the house, do the laundry, and stay completely out of my way. She tried to invoke the concept of sisterhood, weeping, that we were blood, and that she was genuinely terrified of sleeping on the city streets. I listened to her entire frantic plea without interrupting a single word. I did not feel a shred of the guilt she was desperately trying to provoke. I looked at the woman who had happily plotted to ruin my life, steal my fiancé, and claim my hard-earned wealth. I reached into the console table drawer located right next to the door. I had anticipated this exact scenario playing out. I pulled out a single neatly folded sheet of printer paper. I extended my hand and offered it to her. Brittany took it eagerly, looking confused but hopeful. I informed her that the document contained the names, addresses, and intake phone numbers for 3 highly rated women's shelters in the greater metropolitan area. I told her that 2 of them offered excellent vocational training programs for women entering the workforce for the very first time. Brittany stared at the paper, then back at me, her expression violently twisting into a mixture of shock and returning entitlement. She opened her mouth to argue, to demand the luxury she felt she was still owed by her older sister. I did not give her the chance to speak. I told her the audit was officially closed and her account was entirely empty. I stepped back inside, shut the heavy solid oak door firmly in her face, and engaged the deadbolt. The click of my deadbolt was the final punctuation mark on their previous existence. For Richard and Patricia, the descent from the absolute pinnacle of their fabricated high society life to the abrasive reality of working-class poverty was swift and uncompromising. They were forced to relocate to a cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the extreme outskirts of the city, a neighborhood they previously would have locked their car doors while driving through. The sprawling, meticulously manicured lawns of their former estate were replaced by a view of a cracked asphalt parking lot and a flickering neon sign from a neighboring liquor store. The oppressive summer heat baked the small unit, which lacked central air conditioning, forcing them to rely on a single rattling window unit that barely cooled the living room. Stripped entirely of their stolen wealth, their marriage rapidly deteriorated into a toxic, inescapable war zone. Without the buffer of expansive square-footage luxury vehicles and catered country club dinners to distract them, they were forced to finally look at each other. They hated what they saw. The thin, uninsulated walls of their apartment complex offered absolutely no acoustic privacy, meaning their new neighbors were subjected to their relentless screaming matches. The neighborhood police were dispatched on noise complaints twice in the first month alone. Richard paced the cramped, peeling linoleum floors like a caged animal, his face perpetually flushed with rage. He viciously blamed Patricia for their financial execution, shouting that her insatiable, pathetic need to impress women who secretly despised her was the sole reason he had resorted to federal forgery. He hurled her past credit card statements in her face, weaponizing her luxury purchases. Patricia fired back with equal venom. Stripped of her designer wardrobe and forced to shop at discount grocery stores, her carefully maintained high society facade shattered completely. She viciously mocked his business failures, calling him a weak, incompetent fraud who lacked the basic intelligence to execute a simple white-collar crime without leaving a massive paper trail. They had absolutely no one else to turn to. The elite friends they had spent decades courting had completely ghosted them. Patricia's phone, which used to ring constantly with gala invitations and charity board requests, was entirely silent. Richard's former business associates treated him like a highly infectious disease, refusing to even acknowledge him on the street. They were entirely isolated in a prison of their own making, trapped in a sweltering apartment with nothing but their mutual suffocating resentment. They had spent their entire lives trying to project an image of absolute superiority, and now they were suffocating under the weight of their own catastrophic irrelevance. The irony was absolute and unyielding. They had orchestrated an elaborate predatory scheme to secure a multi-million-dollar tech fortune, and their ultimate reward was a lifetime sentence of mutual hatred trapped in a concrete box. Brittany's collision with reality was equally brutal. Without her parents' stolen credit lines to subsidize her delusion of becoming a lifestyle influencer, she faced the terrifying prospect of sustaining her own existence. The women's shelters I recommended provided her with temporary housing and a stark, uncompromising wake-up call. To meet the strict requirements of her transitional housing program, she was forced to secure immediate employment. The golden child, who had never worked a single grueling shift in her entire life, found herself standing behind the cash register of a high-volume fast fashion retail store inside a suburban shopping mall. Her days of lounging by the country club pool were replaced by exhausting 8-hour shifts on her feet, folding endless stacks of denim and being aggressively berated by teenage shift managers for taking unauthorized breaks. The poetic justice of her new environment was stunning. Brittany was now entirely dependent on the exact minimum wage service industry she had spent her entire youth mocking. Customers snapped at her demanding refunds and complaining about store policies she had absolutely no power to change. She wore a mandatory scratchy polyester uniform instead of imported silk. There were no cameras, no brand sponsorships, and absolutely no wealthy tech executives waiting to rescue her. She was just another anonymous retail worker clocking in and out, her manufactured superiority entirely crushed by the relentless grinding reality of honest manual labor. The isolation of the toxic trio became absolute when the final critical support pillar collapsed. Kevin, who had spent his entire life passively enabling our parents' toxic behavior by looking the other way, was finally forced to choose a side. Nia made the decision incredibly simple for him. As a brilliant corporate attorney, she recognized that Richard and Patricia were massive legal and financial liabilities. She sat Kevin down and explicitly laid out the facts. His parents were convicted fraudsters who had attempted to traffic his sister for a corporate bailout. Nia stated with chilling, uncompromising authority that she would not allow that level of criminal toxicity anywhere near her own household or their future children. Kevin finally found his spine. He recognized that maintaining any connection to Richard and Patricia would jeopardize his marriage to a woman he deeply loved and respected. He sent a single formally drafted email to our parents and Brittany. He informed them that due to their severe predatory actions against me, he and Nia were severing all contact permanently. He explicitly instructed them not to call, email, or attempt to visit their home under any circumstances. When Patricia tried to circumvent the boundary by showing up at Kevin's office, sobbing, Nia had building security escort her off the premises and filed a formal cease and desist order. The toxic enablers were now completely quarantined. The gang-up had been entirely dismantled piece by piece until nothing remained but a shattered, impoverished family reflecting on their catastrophic failure. Exactly 1 year later, the harsh fluorescent lights of corporate audits and the sterile, suffocating opulence of the Oak Ridge Estate Country Club felt like a distant, irrelevant lifetime away. I stood on a sun-drenched, terraced garden perched high above the Tyrrhenian Sea on the Amalfi Coast. The salty Mediterranean breeze mingled with the scent of blooming lemon groves, creating an atmosphere of absolute, untainted peace. This was our true wedding. There were no imported ice sculptures designed to mask financial ruin, and there were certainly no desperate performative speeches intended to impress wealthy investors. David and I had traded the sprawling 150-guest spectacle of my mother's fraudulent social ambitions for a fiercely guarded, intimate celebration of exactly 50 people who genuinely loved and respected us. I wore a sleek, minimalist silk gown that I had chosen simply because I loved how it moved, not because it needed to project a fabricated narrative of generational wealth. As I walked down the cobblestone pathway toward the cliffside altar, I did not feel the crushing, anxious weight of familial expectations bearing down on my shoulders. I only felt the warm Italian sun on my skin and the absolute certainty of the man waiting for me at the end of the aisle. David stood there looking devastatingly handsome in a navy linen suit, his eyes locked entirely on mine. There was no hesitation in his stance, no performative country club posturing, just the steady, unwavering devotion of a partner who had stood shoulder to shoulder with me in the absolute trenches of my family's warfare. When he took my hands at the altar, his grip was just as grounding and fiercely protective as it had been on the day we walked away from that disastrous summer barbecue. We exchanged our vows not as a business transaction or a desperate bailout strategy, but as two independent, fully realized adults actively choosing to build a secure, impenetrable life together. The applause that echoed across the cliffs when we finally kissed was not the polite, calculating golf clap of wealthy socialites sizing up an acquisition. It was the loud, joyous, and fiercely genuine celebration of a community that knew exactly what we had survived to get to this beautiful sunlit cliff. As we transitioned from the ceremony to the outdoor reception, under a breathtaking canopy of interwoven vines and glowing fairy lights, I looked around the long, rustic wooden dining tables. The seating arrangement was a visual testament to the absolute power of choosing your own circle. The only biological family members present from my side were Kevin and Nia. Kevin looked 10 years younger, entirely free from the suffocating pressure of enabling our parents' toxic delusions. He raised his glass of wine to me, his smile genuine, relaxed, and finally at peace. Beside him, Nia looked stunning in a vibrant, jewel-toned dress, giving me that same sharp, approving nod she had delivered across the ballroom before we initiated the massive country club audit. They had actively chosen peace over toxic loyalty, and they were thriving because of it. The rest of the chairs were filled with David's family, who had welcomed me with a loud, unconditional warmth that I had never experienced growing up. His parents did not view me as a financial asset to be leveraged or a liability to be hidden. They simply saw the woman who loved their son. The remaining seats belonged to our fiercely loyal friends, the colleagues and mentors who had celebrated my promotions, supported my independence, and proved that true loyalty is earned through mutual respect, not demanded through shared genetics. There was no anxiety about someone causing a public scene, no scanning the room for passive-aggressive threats or hidden agendas. Every single person sitting at that table had earned their seat through authentic, unwavering support. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the Mediterranean waters in brilliant shades of violet and gold, I took a moment to step away from the lively music and the laughter. I stood alone at the edge of the stone terrace, looking out over the vast darkening sea. For the first 30 years of my life, I had been aggressively conditioned to believe that losing my biological family would leave me entirely bankrupt, isolated, and fundamentally empty. Patricia and Richard had weaponized my independence, insisting that walking away from their conditional love would mean a lifetime of lonely, miserable failure. They were spectacularly, unequivocally wrong. Severing those deeply toxic ties did not leave me with an empty, barren plot of land. The surgical removal of their endless manipulation, crippling greed, and constant psychological gaslighting had simply cleared the hazardous debris. It completely leveled the corrupted, rotting foundation they had built, providing me with the vast, pristine acreage required to construct my own empire from the ground up. I had audited my own life, aggressively cutting the massive liabilities and investing solely in assets of high emotional and moral yield. Through ruthless boundaries and undeniable truth, I had successfully built a brilliant empire of genuine trust, impenetrable peace, and unconditional love. David came up behind me, wrapping his strong arms securely around my waist and resting his chin comfortably on my shoulder. We stood together in the warm Italian night, listening to the joyous, unburdened laughter of our chosen family echoing from the dining tables behind us. I leaned back into his warm embrace, closing my eyes and taking a deep, entirely unobstructed breath of the salty ocean air. The rigorous audit was permanently closed. The accounts were perfectly balanced without a single discrepancy. The ledger of my entire life was finally beautifully in the black. The story of Natalie and her family offers a powerful lesson on the importance of self-worth and establishing boundaries. It illustrates that our value isn't determined by the approval or validation of others, even those closest to us like our family. Natalie spent much of her life trying to earn her family's acceptance, hoping her achievements would change how they saw her. However, the painful realization that they viewed her social anxiety as a flaw and prioritized their image over her inclusion in her sister's wedding became a catalyst for change. Instead of continuing to fight for a place where she wasn't wanted, she chose to remove herself and focus on her own well-being. This act of stepping away was not just an escape, but a profound act of self-care. It allowed her to see that true security and fulfillment come from within, not from meeting external expectations. By embracing her authentic self and refusing to accept mistreatment, she found a sense of liberation. The narrative emphasizes that while family dynamics can be deeply hurtful, we have the power to define our own success and choose the people who genuinely support us. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do for ourselves is to walk away from toxic environments and build a life that aligns with our own values. Take a moment to reflect on your own relationships and consider whether you need to establish boundaries to protect your peace and authenticity.